Welcome to Baruch College, the School of Public Affairs, and the second night of the 4th Annual Public Affairs Week. This is a very important series of events for the School of Public Affairs. It's an opportunity for faculty and for students to come face-to-face with senior policymakers, senior thinkers about policy problems, and people who have been involved with program administration in a variety of settings. We bring together, as we can see tonight, a wide variety of students with a wide variety of interests in the whole panoply of what it means to think carefully about and to execute well with respect to policy problems, and none is more important than education. Tonight is also a special event because it is a co-sponsored event. This is also the Spring Ackerman Lecture. The Ackerman Lecture Series, generously endowed by Erwin and Rosalind Engelman, has for a long while at the School of Public Affairs subvented the cost of providing students with a direct encounter with people who are thinking about issues that are central to questions of social justice. And today, we're particularly happy because this lecture is going to stretch across the spring, over the summer, and into the fall, when the first Ackerman event for the fall session of 2007 will be a full-day conference on access to education and educational opportunity, thinking particularly about that very fraught transition from high school to college. Today, we're going to be looking at the earlier segment of that pipeline question, but I wanted to make everybody aware tonight that there will be a larger discussion about this that will consume us in many ways for the next 6 months. And there will be information available on the Center for Equality, Pluralism, and Policy section of the School of Public Affairs website that provides background information as we build toward the one-day conference. That's October 4th of 2007. Please mark your calendars. We are going to look forward to having that event, and we're going to look forward to seeing it under the leadership of Sonia Jarvis, our Ackerman lecturer for this year. Sonia, do you want to wave? And Professor Lynn Weichert is co-sponsoring that event as well. We're looking forward to a wonderful session. Tonight's session is going to be lively. We have two people with deep experience in this area. I won't introduce them myself, but it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Dorothy Ships. Professor Ships is a specialist in education policy. She was an early member of the Chicago Consortium for Education Research. She has thought carefully about how it is that you match sound research on education and educational outcomes with the programs that produce those outcomes, and I can think of no one better to lead this discussion this evening. Dorothy.
Good evening, and thank you for coming to what tonight I think will be a discussion about what many believe in the United States is perhaps the most important issue in education today, certainly in K-12 education. Tonight we discuss the achievement gap with two distinguished experts in the field. Some of you may know Richard Rothstein as the national education columnist of the New York Times, a post that he held until the year of 2002. He is, however, currently a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and an adjunct lecturer at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. He is also, by my count, the author or the editor of at least 7 books on school finance, school choice, and the achievement gap. Tonight, he's speaking to us about his most recent book on that last topic, the achievement gap, entitled Class and Schools, Using Social and Economic Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap. I'm hoping that many of you will have read parts of that. That was the assignment for tonight. Some of you have read all of it. Many of you also know Herman Badillo in his political capacity as a former U.S. congressman, our own Bronx Borough president, and deputy mayor of New York. Others will know him as a past president of the CUNY Board of Trustees. He has been with us, but for even longer than that, however. Mr. Badillo is a cum laude graduate of City College and has his JD from Brooklyn College. He is currently a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he is in private law practice. Tonight, he is speaking to us about his perspective on the achievement gap, which he tells us about in his book, also available here tonight, which is One Nation, One Standard, an ex-liberal on how Hispanics can succeed just like other immigrant groups. Mr. Rothstein and Mr. Badillo focus on different aspects of the achievement gap. Each brings a very different approach to the topic. In order to help you see the differences in their approaches, we've agreed tonight that I will ask both of them a series of questions that were designed to draw out their unique ways that they approach the problem. What kinds of information each of them sought, and how each sees a solution to the problem. It is our hope that you will leave tonight with a better understanding about how Mr. Badillo and Mr. Rothstein drew upon the sources of data they used in the books that you read, and therefore why the two of them have reached what probably look like, at first blush, opposing conclusions. You may determine that their two solutions actually coexist, however, by the time you leave tonight, as long as policymakers do not believe that one solution must fit all students equally well. As you all know, the achievement gap is generally defined in racial and ethnic terms. It is the stubbornly persistent gap between the average test score achievement of Black and Latino students on the one hand and that of Asian and white students on the other. Although an achievement gap has been measured with quite a lot of consistency for many decades now in tests, it is not widely known. Why? Because the tests that were used until recently, for instance, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, was not widely understood or known by the public. However, since the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act and its implementation in 2001, we now have a different situation. The Act required that states test all students in most grades and report those scores to the public every year. Those test scores have to be disaggregated by race and ethnicity. Now every parent and every civic leader can see how different groups of students perform in the schools. And schools and teachers, as well as students who do poorly on these tests, feel consequences. Although overall test scores often go up in cities where there are high consequences or high stakes put on these tests, the achievement gap has not shown much evidence of closing. In some cities, it is even widening since the year 2000. If the spirit of leaving no child behind is truly to be honored, then we have to figure out how to close that gap. And our authors tonight will tell us how they would like that to happen. It's a complicated problem. There are likely to be different solutions for different groups of students. So let's begin. Let's start with Mr. Rothstein. My first question to you is, how would you change that very broad definition I created of the achievement gap? In other words, what is the achievement gap problem that you set out to describe and to find solutions for in your book?
Well, Dorothy, I'm focused primarily in my book on differences in average achievement between Black and white students and between students who come from low-income or lower-class families and middle-class students. And I think that these gaps in average achievement reflect differences not only in the quality of schools that children attend, but they also reflect the social class differences that children bring to school. I think that the difficulty with the way we approach this problem as a society today is we expect schools alone to solve a problem which is far beyond their ability to solve because it's not generated in schools. We know, for example, that there's an achievement gap between lower class and middle class students, between Black and white students, by age 3. Children from families where parents are college educated, where they're literate, are exposed to much more complex language. They're exposed to larger vocabularies. They're exposed to literacy experiences that children from families which are less educated are not exposed to. There was, if I could take a second to describe this, and many of you may be familiar with this, there was a interesting research project done in Kansas about 15 years ago in which some researchers took tape recorders and put them in the homes of children from different social classes, infants and toddlers, up to the age of 3. And then they collected the tape recorders and had their graduate students analyze those recordings. And what they found was that children, infants and toddlers up to the age of 3 who came from families which were professionals, middle-class families, heard, and I'm not suggesting that infants and toddlers were speaking, but they heard in the background an average of 2,000 words an hour. The infants and toddlers from families who were working class heard an average of about 1,300 words an hour. The children from the families who were on welfare heard an average of 600 words an hour. By the time they were age 3, this is long before they ever come close to school. By the time they were age 3, the middle-class children had vocabularies of their own that were twice as large as the lower-class children had. Now, I don't care how good your teaching is, how high your expectations, how good your curriculum, how well-trained the teachers are. If you take 2 groups of children, one of which has heard an average of 2,000 words an hour from the time they were born, and the other of which has heard an average of 600 words an hour from the time they were born, if both had equally effective teaching, there would be an average gap in their achievement as they move through school. And it's those kinds of differences in the social class backgrounds of children that create this achievement gap. Of course, good schools can try to narrow it, and good schools do narrow it. But they can't wipe out these kinds of what the authors of the Kansas researchers called meaningful differences in the background characteristics of children.
Mr. Badillo, you define the achievement gap quite differently. Can you tell us a little bit about your definition?
Well, I'm happy that there are tests that measure the achievement gap, and I'm delighted that we have the National Assessment of Educational Process in the No Child Leave Behind law, but that's mostly for those of us who are experts. This doesn't get down to the average parent. What I call the achievement gap is to something that is measured by results, what actually happens. And what actually happens, certainly as far as the Latino community is concerned, is an absolute tragedy, because depending on how you count it, more than 50% of the Latino children don't even graduate from high school. Now, of course, Chancellor Klein says 58% of the kids graduate from high school, but the state says it's only 43. And there's a question about whether you count the people who dropped out earlier or whether you count certain other groups. But certainly, from my point of view, it is a national tragedy to have such a large percentage of Latino children not even graduating from high school, because today a high school diploma is worthless. You need to go far beyond high school and into college. And even those poor kids who do go on in the Latino community to college, less than 1/4 of them graduate. And I'll tell you why this is such a national tragedy. Because we in the Latino community now constitute about 42 million people, and that's about 15% of the national population. And it is predicted that by the year, say 50 years from now, we will amount to over 102 million people, or 25% of the population. And if you have a group that is the largest ethnic group in the country, and it represents 15 to 25% of the population, and the kids are not learning, that is a national crisis of enormous proportions that affects everybody, because many of the older people, like Bill Clinton and the guys who reached advanced age, are counting on the younger people to provide for them as the years go on. That isn't going to happen if these people are not able to get any meaningful employment. And so I point out in my book that this is an urgent crisis that is not being met at the present time.
You know, I want to jump in with one question to each of you on this problem. Often when we talk about the achievement gap in classes, the issue of racism or prejudice, even the role of culture comes in. And I'd like each of you to take in turn how you handle that. To what extent is this achievement gap actually a reflection of some kind of national dilemma, the American dilemma, racism in the case of the black-white gap, or prejudice and culture for the Latino gap?
Well, the achievement gap, as I described it before, and again, I'm focusing primarily on blacks and whites and lower class and middle class children. It's the product of a vast array of different forces, all of which make up social class differences in a society like ours. Certainly discrimination plays a role. There are many people who say that discrimination has disappeared in this country, but it's not disappeared. It's certainly less pervasive than perhaps it once was, but it still plays a role. You know, I gave the example before about the children's vocabularies when they enter school, and I said if you take two groups of children with exactly the same in every respect except for the kinds of early childhood experiences that they had, you would not expect them to have the same average achievement. Well, there was a study done a couple of years ago by a sociologist at Northwestern University in which she took black and white college graduates and had them fill out job applications, each of them pretending to be high school graduates only. And then they took these applications to places that were recruiting high school graduates for jobs. They did not go to interviews. They simply dropped off the applications so that the receptionist would see their race but knew nothing more about them. The applications were identical except that she had them in groups, and one group of white applicants had criminal records for drug arrests, and a group of black applicants had no criminal records. Other respects, they were exactly the same. The whites with the criminal records got called for interviews at a higher rate than the blacks with no criminal records. Now, this is not an enormous problem, but it's a tiny part of it. Now, if you take, again, two groups of high school students, one of which knows that they're going to face discrimination in the workplace, no matter how big it is, but they're going to face some discrimination. The other which is confident it will face no discrimination in the workplace. On average, and again, we're only talking about averages, on average, the group that knows it's going to face discrimination in the workplace is going to put less effort into their high school studies because it's going to have less payoff. If you use a simple economic analysis, if the same effort is going to have less payoff, you're less likely to put that effort into it than a group that knows it's going to have more payoff. So discrimination plays a small role. Differences in health play a small role. Differences in housing play a role. We know that student mobility has a big impact on student achievement. Students who are highly mobile can't learn at the same effective rate as children who are stable. So if you take all of these social class conditions, each one contributes a tiny bit to the achievement gap, and after a while you've got an achievement gap that's totally explained by all of these things.
Socioeconomic explanation. Tell me, how do you respond to that question about the role of culture or prejudice?
There's no question that in the case of the Latino community, the problem is entirely cultural. I have a chapter in my book which I call the 5-century siesta, that is from 1492 to 2007. And I call it that because our mother country was Spain. And when Columbus discovered America, Spain was not interested at all in really populating and colonizing Latin America and the Caribbean and at all. They only wanted to get gold and silver and take it back to Spain, because in those days Spain was the most powerful country in the world, and it was a very united country. And so from 1500 to 1808, when Spain was in charge of all of Central and Latin America, they had no interest whatsoever in education or in democracy. For that matter, Spain has only had democracy for about 35 years when Franco died, and only because King Juan Carlos stopped the coup. Otherwise, they would have gone back to a dictatorship. But that attitude prevailed in the colonies, and nobody really learned anything. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1888, the colonies were able to break away from Spain, and they set up what are now the Latin American countries. But unfortunately, the people who took over were what I call the caudillos, and it became the era of the caudillo, which were really authoritarian people who also didn't care about the masses at all and were not interested in either democracy or a constitution. Give you one example. At one point when I was in Congress, we made a group of congressmen to Guatemala. And we met with the president of the country. And he said to us, you American congressmen have to understand that it's not easy to rule these people. So my colleague said to me, what is he talking about, these people? Isn't he the president? I said, yeah, he's the president, but he's a Spaniard. He's a white man. He's talking about the masses of the people. And he only cares about the upper 2% of the population, not about the 98%. Wait, tomorrow I'm going to take you to the hills, and then you'll see the real people. Tomorrow we went into the hills. We talked to the Indians. We asked them, where are the schools? They said, schools? No schools. Oh, yeah. There is a place they call a school 50 miles from now, but you have to pay to go to that school. Nobody had any education. And this is the attitude that has prevailed and still prevails even today, because we have people who are basically dictators, who are like Castro. They go on forever and ever. One fellow just became a president of a country, and he fired all the judges, and he started writing his own constitution. They don't believe in a permanent constitution. They don't believe in a Bill of Rights. There never was an industrial revolution. There never was the equivalent of a French revolution in Latin America. So another 200 years of being asleep and having a siesta. So the people who come here, all of us from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, or all these countries, come from a tradition where there is no education. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to change the culture, to explain that today education is the most important thing that we can do, that we can have, and to have the parents and get involved to make sure that the kids get an education and that they go on to college, because it's not going to come from those who continue to come here from the Latin American countries.
So the two of you have quite different definitions of this problem. You're coming at it from different perspectives. You've got culture versus economic social class. Who's responsible for this achievement gap? And who should be held accountable for fixing it? Richard?
Well, I think I've said, maybe I'll say it a different way. I think it's a reflection of the inequalities in the broader society. And those inequalities express themselves in every social and economic institution of this society. Who should be held accountable for fixing it? Well, we should all be held accountable for fixing it, but we cannot fix it with schools alone, which is not to say we shouldn't try to improve schools to do a better job in educating disadvantaged children. But we're responsible for providing adequate health care for children so that they can come to school ready to learn. We're responsible, as I suggested before, for addressing the housing crisis in our urban centers, which keeps students highly mobile. Rents in New York City are rising at a much more rapid rate than the wages of working families with children. The result of that is that families move around a lot. They fall behind on the rent and they move. They double up with relatives. They move from school to school. And children who are moving from school to school cannot learn at the same rate on average as children who are stable. So we're responsible for fixing the housing crisis in this society. We're responsible for fixing the vast income inequalities, which give some parents the ability to provide children with space to do homework or adequate housing, with support from being at home and not having to work 2 and 3 jobs. We're responsible for those things as well. And we're responsible for improving the conditions of our schools at which low-income children attend, so that the teachers are well enough paid to attract highly qualified teachers, so that we don't have overcrowded classes. So we deal with all of these kinds of institutions at once. And if we dealt with all of them at once, we would begin to make progress. I don't think we're ever going to close the achievement gap. And I don't think it's a realistic expectation to close the achievement gap. Closing the achievement gap means having a classless society. We're not going to have a classless society. Every industrialized country has an achievement gap between children in different points in the socioeconomic distribution. But most industrialized societies don't have gaps as large as we have, and that's not because they have better schools. It's because they address the problems of disadvantaged families on a variety of fronts, not just in schools alone.
I think the responsibility for the achievement gap is with the parents and with the families. Now, I don't have much faith in the educational system. There are many things that need to be done to improve it, and you know I did some of those here at the City University when I eliminated open admissions at the senior colleges. And there are many things I've tried to eliminate in the public school system, like social promotion, tracking, and many other things. But the proof that this is the case is in the case of the Asian community. Now, the Hispanics like to use any number of excuses, that we are poor, that we don't speak the language, that we are discriminated against. Well, the Asians have the same problems and bigger. They're discriminated against more than we are. They have language problems, and they also are poor people. And yet, the Asians, when they, in one generation, are able to come and do remarkably well, even better than the whites, at Stuyvesant High School, at Bronx High School, at the Ivy League colleges, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, the percentage of Asians is 20% of the student body, and yet the Asians are only 4% of the population. So the Asian community is able to overcome all of these obstacles. When I was chairman of the board of CUNY, went to a graduation at City College, I thought it was in Chinatown because practically everybody was Asian, and they were not rich people. I could tell from the way they were dressed that the women worked in factories and the men worked in restaurants, but they were very proud of the fact that their children were going to be engineers. And the studies have shown that the Asian community gives the highest priority to education. Not just the parents, but the entire family verifies that the kids are learning. They make sure they can read and write. They provide tutoring for them. By the way, the No Child Left Behind bill provides tutoring for free, and yet we don't use 2/3 of the money that is available in New York City today. But it is because of this passion for education on behalf of the family that the Asians are able to perform within the same lousy school system. And so are the white communities. So we have a lousy school system, and yet whites and Asians are able to perform, and that's why I say that Latinos should be able to perform, and blacks as well. If the concentration is on focusing on education on behalf of whatever family there may be, because it's done by other groups.
You see the differences, right? Let me move on to some question that I've also been asked a lot when the achievement gap comes on. The agenda, and that's a question about tests. As we said, No Child Left Behind has left us a legacy of lots of testing in the schools. So has the attempt in New York City to rid ourselves of the issue of social promotion, that is passing students from grade to grade without evidence that they've achieved the competence in the work required in that grade. Both of these movements have led us to much more testing. And I want to ask both of you, since clearly our understanding of the achievement gap is predicated on the existence of these tests in many ways, what do you see as the value of the tests in either identifying going on in the future or maybe even in closing the achievement gap?
Well, I think we're following a very dangerous policy in public education today with the excessive focus on testing. If you take any institution, whether it's schools or business, any institution that has multiple goals, and you hold that institution for achieving only some of the goals, inevitably what will happen is the institution will begin to redirect its attention and its resources away from the goals that you're not holding it accountable for and towards the goals that you will hold it accountable for. Now, we have a lot of things we want out of public schools. We want students to read and write and do math. But we also want them to be good citizens. We want them to develop social skills and a work ethic. We want them to learn how to participate as citizens in a democracy. We want to appreciate the arts and literature. We want them to come out of school in good physical and emotional health. If we hold schools accountable only for their math and reading scores, which is what we're doing, it is inevitable that what schools will do is what, in fact, they are doing. They will drop social studies and science and arts and music. They will eliminate cooperative learning and character development and focus only on drilling students for tests, because that's what the incentives are for. So I think we're doing enormous harm to public education by the excessive focus on tests. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't do any testing, but it has to be balanced with a system of accountability to hold schools accountable for doing a wide range of activities. I'll give you one example. We have a epidemic in this country, particularly in minority Black and Hispanic communities, of diabetes, which leads to heart disease and shortened lifespans. We also have a situation in schools where physical education is being reduced, particularly for children from low-income and minority families, because those are the children who score lowest on the standardized tests in math and reading, and if the schools are going to be held accountable for those tests, they have the greatest incentive to eliminate physical education in order to do more drill in math and reading. So we are, in our schools, contributing to the epidemic of obesity and diabetes in low-income and minority communities as an unintended consequence of this obsessive focus on math and reading scores. Now, it also, of course, reduces math and reading to its most basic and elements, which do not comprise the full description of what a good reader or somebody with quantitative skills are. Those are entirely different problems within the math and reading area. But just between math and reading and the other subjects, we're redirecting our attention away from many, many important goals of schools. And in fact, as I said a minute ago, we're widening the achievement gap in every area except math and reading by our focus on math and reading. You cannot have an institution with multiple goals in which you hold it accountable only for some of those goals.
How would you respond, Mr. Badillo?
Well, I think we need to have tests, but the problem is that we are applying tests when we have, in fact, different school systems. For example, it took me 30 years to eliminate open admissions from 1969 to 1999. I've been trying even longer to eliminate social promotion. And so far, I've only been successful in eliminating 3 grades, the 3rd grade, the 5th grade, and the 7th grade. That means I still have 9 more grades to go. And so if the kids are being passed automatically in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, it doesn't mean they're learning anything. And in addition to that, most people do not know that we have segregated schools in New York City. They're not segregated by having one school for whites, another one for blacks and Latinos. They're segregated within the same school. In other words, within the same school, you have a classroom that is the so-called special progress. If you look closely, that's where the whites and the Asians are. There's another classroom that is called academic, and the last thing it is academic, because that's where the blacks and the Latinos are. There's a different curriculum for the SB than there is for the academic, and therefore, in the SP, you get to read classics. In the other one, they sit around and think about what they might be reading in 10-minute segments. Therefore, it's unfair to say you're going to give the same test to kids when, in fact, it's 2 different school systems that are going along in tandem.
This is not a great commentary on the use of tests, but I want to jump to your solutions because that's what we're all here tonight to hear. Okay, so what do each of you propose as a solution for closing the achievement gap as you define it? And because this is a school of public affairs, could you tell us what you think government can do, if anything?
Well, I don't want to repeat myself, but I guess I will. I think government has a great deal to do on all fronts in this society where the enormous inequalities express themselves and lead to differences in achievement. I'll give another example. If it all leads to the same point. Low-income children have much higher rates of absenteeism because of illness from school than middle-class children, because they have less adequate health care. It's not because they don't have insurance. We've provided Medicaid, and through the CHIP program, we've provided insurance to low-income children. But the communities in which low-income children live don't have primary care physicians. They have clinics and emergency rooms where parents can take children if they're ill, and parents do take children when they're ill. But it's unrealistic to expect low-income working parents who are paid by the hour and who lose time from their already low wages when they take time off from work, to expect them to take time off from work to take their children for routine and preventive care that middle-class children regularly get, but that requires an enormous amount of time if there are no local physicians in your community to do so. That problem can very easily be solved. It can be easily solved by placing health clinics, full-service health clinics, not just with nurses to bandage up bruised knees, but full-service health clinics in schools where there are pediatricians and optometrists and dentists giving children the routine preventive care that middle-class children characteristically get. It would be a very inexpensive thing to do because it's all reimbursable by Medicaid. So if I were in charge of the schools in New York City, that's the first thing I would do is I'd put health clinics in the schools, and I guarantee you would get a boost in achievement if you ensured that children in these schools had good health. You know, the Surgeon General, 10 years ago, published a national study in which he showed that low-income children, 1/3 of them have untreated dental cavities. Now, you know, I don't know what that means. Anybody here married to a dentist? No? Okay, I can speak freely then and make something up. So let's say if you have an untreated dental cavity, half the time you have a toothache. You know, what that is saying is that in a low-income community, if you take any group of children, 1/6 of them are likely to have a toothache at any given time. 1/6 of them are less able to pay attention. On any day you give a test, 1/6 of them are less able to focus on that test. Putting a dentist in the school is an inexpensive way of taking care of that tiny part of the achievement gap. And this is something that public policy can easily do. So that we should be operating on all of these fronts. We should be operating on providing high-quality early childhood care to deal with the readiness for school that I spoke at the very beginning. We should be dealing with children's health. As a matter of national policy, we should be doing something about the housing crisis in urban communities. And we should be improving schools. We should be raising the salaries of teachers so we can attract more qualified people to teach in our urban elementary schools. But we're not going to solve the problem by focusing only on one of those things and expecting school reform or more accountability for schools to solely, on its own, do something which is a reflection of the entire structure of our society.
Let me jump back with you, Mr. Rothstein, and ask one more pointed question. I know you've covered this in your book. I want you to talk to us about what is this going to cost? This is a lot, right? This is not a trivial agenda for improving American education and the prospects of our youth.
Well, you're right. It is expensive, although it's not as expensive as you think. As I indicated a minute ago, putting clinics in schools is money we've already made available. It's Medicaid reimbursable. If we put clinics in schools in New York City with pediatricians, with optometrists, with dentists in those schools, that's all Medicaid reimbursable, so it wouldn't cost very much. The housing problem is not that difficult to solve. It would cost some money. We do have a Section 8 housing voucher program, for example, in this country, which is supposed to make up the difference for working families with children. It's not a welfare program for working families with children between 1/3 of their incomes and the median rents in the communities where they live. The problem is the program is underfunded. There are long waiting lists. If we fully funded the Section 8 housing voucher program, we would make a dent in the achievement gap from that one thing alone. You know, there was a study done in Texas a few years ago in which they found that if you simply reduced the mobility rate of black students to the rate of white students, you would eliminate 1/7 of the achievement gap between black and white students from that one intervention alone. So we focus all of our attention on trying to do this through schools when there are many other areas of social policy that are available to us to try to address this problem. Of course it takes investments, but the price we're paying for not doing this is enormous. There have been a number of studies released recently, and I know you're familiar with them, in which they show that the investments in high-quality early childhood programs, high quality. I'm not talking about daycare centers where children are parked in front of television sets. But the investments in high-quality early childhood programs pay off 7 to 1 in the long term for society as a whole. For every dollar invested in high-quality early childhood programs, $7 is saved in the long term in reduced crime, in reduced public dependency, in welfare, in higher graduation rates, reducing dropout rates, and so forth. So it's true, it takes some investment to try to narrow these gaps, but it also pays off in the long run to do so.
Mr. Badillo.
Yes, I'm one person who has tried to bring about the changes that you asked for and that you talked about, perhaps more than anyone else. When I was in Congress, I was one of the strongest liberal that there was. I never approved one penny to support the Vietnam War. I bought it automatically against the defense budget. And I was considered the bravest man in Congress because I was the only one who dared to sit between Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm. Everybody was terrified of it. And I supported programs for jobs for all, housing for all, health care for all, benefits for all. But I came to the conclusion that that is never going to happen, that government is not going to do that at all. The most that government does is approve a pilot program. My colleagues would say to me, Badillo, what are you complaining about? We gave you money for a housing project in the South Bronx. I said, I want to rebuild the whole South Bronx. Well, that's too much already. You got to be satisfied with what we have. And there's still people who talk about that. Believe it or not, Barack Obama, if you read the speech that he gave when he announced that he was running for president, he actually said that he is going to abolish poverty in the United States and provide jobs for all. That's the most outrageous statement imaginable, because he isn't going to do anything like that. And the problem with that is a lot of poor people, Latinos who hear that, they actually believe it. They still believe it's possible for government to do these things. And Hillary has been talking about health care for all since 1993, 14 years, and we still don't know what she's saying. So, but again, people who listen will come to the conclusion that, yeah, maybe government will do something about health care. They're not going to do it. I'm telling you because I was there. And that's why in the last 15 years, I have been concentrating on education, because there is an answer to poverty, and that is to go out and get a good education. If you get a good education, you'll get your own job, your own housing, your own health care, and meet your family's needs. And it's got to be done by yourself. It's not going to be done by government. And all those unfortunate people who are being misled into believing that government is going to do it are really going through a tragedy, because it just is not going to happen in that way.
Let me ask you a similar follow-up question. And that is not a question about dollars, because you're not talking about spending government dollars.
Yeah.
But what would families have to give up to do what you're talking about? What would Latino and Hispanic families have to give up?
Realize what other groups have done. I call it one nation, one standard, because all the other ethnic groups who came here, the Italians, the Jews, the Irish, they came as poor people, but they came to realize that the way to get ahead in this country is to get a good education. And they caught on right away, and they went on to get a good education. They made the sacrifices necessary. I mean, the people that I saw at that graduation in City College, they were so proud that the children were able to move ahead. They have to understand that government is not going to do these things for you, and that the educators in the school system are not going to do it. Hardly anybody in the city university lifted a finger about the fact that for 30 years they were giving diplomas to kids who couldn't pass an exam in English. Professors at City College, college presidents. It's not going to be done by educators at the college level. It's not going to be done by educators in the teaching system. They know that social promotion is no good, but they continue it. They know that tracking is going on. They know that it's not working. They are not going to change. And if you try to change it, which I did once when I was deputy mayor, then the moment you leave, they put it right back again. So you have to understand that it has to be the responsibility of those who bring the children into the world, that this has the greatest responsibility they have in this country. In the old days, you could get along without an education. When I came here from Puerto Rico, I worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant. Now we have automatic washing machines. I worked as a pin boy in a bowling alley. Now the bowling alleys are automatic. I worked as an elevator boy. Now the elevators are automatic. I went to Congress. Nixon tried to abolish Congress, but we got rid of him. Otherwise, we'd be in trouble. But the point is that hundreds of thousands of jobs have been eliminated because of automation. I'm a CPA from Baruch School, but now computers take over the work that bookkeepers used to do. So over the years, more and more, automation takes care of jobs that people used to do in the old days. And so you need to have an education to keep up with the machines. Otherwise, you will be unemployable. And that message has got to be given over to the parents to make sure that your kid goes into the classes where really learning is going on, and do as many parents in the middle classes do. When the moment a child is born, they open up a bank account for the kid to go to college, and let the kids that they are supposed to go to college. And especially in New York City, where we have so many opportunities to go to college, even if you're poor, because we have tuition assistance programs. There's no excuse for parents to say there's no money for a college education. There are resources available, but we have to impress upon them that they must take care of these resources, of the opportunities.
Thank you. I suspect that our exciting and interesting guests have got a few of you going with questions of your own. Now's the time that we get to do that. If you have a question, please go and stand at one of the microphones.
I guess I have to stand up and say something because I am the stereotypical Puerto Rican who was an airplane mechanic. Went through the public education system.
By the way, the airplane engines are still there at the high school for marine and aviation.
But I must say, coming out of the projects into and the airline industry, I worked for El Al for 2 years. I worked for Polar Air Cargo. I was making $55,000 at the age of 21, which I can't say that for most 25-year-olds who are coming out of college now. So the public education system did me some good, I must say. Coming from a mother who had cancer by the age of 14 and a father who was pretty much a deadbeat. And I still got a master's degree and a bachelor's from Hofstra, and now I'm here at Public Affairs working on my second. So that being said, I guess I kind of break some of the stereotypes you were talking about. But my question is, as far as about 2 years ago, I went on a rampage in my school because I became a teacher at University Heights in the Bronx. And I went on a rampage with the elected officials. I knocked on their doors. I even took students. Because the school is a disaster, the neighborhood is a disaster, and I got Mr. Efrain Gonzalez to come, which is pretty interesting, because after him and the Bronx Borough President came and Mr. Diaz, about 9 months later, I see Efrain Gonzalez in the news for embezzlement and money being stolen, and by the way, some of that money was supposed to go to our school to fix up the auditorium. So this being said, I'm as a teacher, I'm really getting tired of this being thrusted on teachers. When will the accountability fall on the elected officials that represent us? If we elect, and I must say, I'm throwing it back as a Puerto Rican to a Puerto Rican. How do we get the Puerto Ricans that we elect to represent Puerto Rican community and the poor community, the Black and Latino community? How do we make them accountable to our communities, the ones they're supposed to be serving, which is why they were elected in the first place? It wasn't for their personal benefit.
They're not going to do it. Look, they didn't support me. They never have. So, even though they all started with me. But once they get in, you have to listen carefully to what I said. They become dependent upon the unions because that's where they are reelected. And therefore, they look after their sources, just like the people running for president look after those who contribute the millions of dollars that they need to be elected. And therefore, they're not going to take on the unions. They're not going to do that. So that's why I say we have to, they should. I agree with you. But if we want to bring about change, We have to look for where realistically there is an opportunity to bring about change, and it's not the politicians.
Mr. Rothstein, you're going to have the last word tonight. I know that you've been listening to this, and my guess is that you have something to say about whether or not politicians have been held accountable adequately, and whether or not the reason that they are not held accountable, if they aren't, is because of unions.
No, I don't think that that unions are the problem. I think we have a problem in this country in the ideology of our public life, and it's an ideological problem much more than a self-interest problem, and that is we have a resistance to considering effective levers of public change, of social change, and want to focus all of our energy on schools as though schools can solve all the problems. Let me, if I can take a minute, let me illustrate this with something that Mr. Badillo has brought up a couple of times. It's not the case that education is the key to the new economy. What all the data show, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects, for example, is that only about 25% of the future job openings in this economy will require a college education. It's not the case that people who come out of schools today face a different kind of labor market than the immigrants that Mr. Badillo was talking about 50 years ago. Most of the jobs, the openings that are being created in this economy are low-skilled jobs that don't require an education. As I say, about 25% require a college degree. Another 9% or so require a 2-year technical training. The rest require nothing more than on-the-job training. The big mass of jobs that we're creating in this economy are retail sales jobs. They're truck drivers. They're janitors. We still have dishwashers. We still have people changing bed linens in hotels. We have a vast service economy using unskilled labor. There is a big difference between the immigrants who came into those jobs 50 years ago and their children and those who come in today. And that is that 50 years ago, those jobs were a vehicle to the middle class because we had labor market institutions that were supporting those jobs, because it was easier to organize unions in those jobs. There's nothing that's better about a job banging a hubcap on an automobile on an assembly line than washing dishes in a restaurant. The first is not a good job and the second a bad job. The difference is the first was protected by unions and people were able to increase their wages and move into the middle class. Today we have a period of deunionization where those workers are not protected. Education is not going to solve that problem. If we educate everybody in this country, we're not suddenly going to create a situation where everybody's a college professor and everybody's a doctor and nobody's working in the stores and nobody's driving the trucks and nobody's cleaning the bed linens. We're going to have the kind of economy that is a 21st century economy which does not require higher skill. A few years ago, Amazon came on, and it put a lot of the bookstores out of business, and everybody said, "Oh, this is the new technological age." We're no longer going to have people working in bookstores. We're now going to have people operating computers. Well, Amazon creates jobs for warehousemen and truck drivers. It doesn't create jobs primarily for software designers, and technology de-skills as well as an upgrade skill. We cannot solve the problems of social inequality in this society by education alone. Of course education is important, but by education alone we're not going to solve those problems unless we do something about the conditions of work of the vast numbers of people in this society who are going to have unskilled, low-paid jobs. Unless we do something about the economic inequalities that affect them, we're not going to solve these problems no matter how much education they have. And I would never say that people shouldn't get more education, but no matter how much education they got, they're not going to deal with the inequality problems that face us.
Would Sonia Jarvis like to come up to the stand? There you are, Sonia. Sonia's going to remind you about something that's going to follow up on this particular session.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I hope you found the panel stimulating, because it's the first step in what we hope will be a much broader examination of these issues of equity and education. As Dean Birdsell indicated at the top of the program, we will be having a conference on October 4th, and I would like to personally invite you to attend. I think if we're going to be talking about access to higher education, it will make the program that much more dynamic if you are here and able to interact with the experts that we intend to bring to campus to talk about your experiences. Some of you started that today a little bit in your questions for our panelists. And again, I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists for their time and energy this evening. But I could not end this program without a couple of quick comments. One is that I hope that you do not leave tonight thinking that government cannot make a difference in education. One of the reasons a lot of you are here is because you want to study policy and have a better understanding of how policy can be implemented. If our government wanted to, we could integrate every school in America with community support. If we find that a program that's been passed, like the No Child Left Behind law, is not working, you can fix it. You're learning how, here at Baruch, the skills that would allow you to do so. If you find that a program is not well managed, you can become one of the managers and fix that program. So part of our charge is to make sure that whatever the issue, whether it's education or some of the other social policies we talk about here at Baruch, come under discussion, that you leave here understanding what you can do about it to change it. The statistics are disturbing, but as I said, we can make a difference to turn those around. With your help and with your hard work, we can make equal education a reality in America. Thank you very much.